Hello, I'm Dr Becky Peacock and I am currently the Conservation and Collections Care Manager at the National Railway Museum. But I first started my career at the Watercress Line as the Outreach and Interpretation Officer and subsequently the Project Supervisor on the Canadian Pacific project. Canadian Pacific was moved down to Eastleigh Works for an assessment somewhere to store it under dry cover. There was a small volunteer team there as well who were looking over the vehicle and dismantling it for potential overhaul. And in 2015, the HLF, the Heritage Lottery Fund, awarded the Watercress Line money to actually start the overhaul of Canadian Pacific, as well as the restoration of 2 wooden framed carriages, which builds this really wonderful project, which had a whole host of other elements like outreach and education and interpretation being put in place at Ropley. And so the project really started with that influx of funding, and it was the small volunteer team down at Eastleigh who were really kind of spearheading that project, working tirelessly to kind of dismantle it, send parts up to Ropley. So in terms of an engineering project, it was really difficult because you had the locomotive in one place and you had all of the facilities to build that locomotive in another. So you were constantly transporting parts backwards and forwards. And then we also had the issue of Eastleigh being quite a kind of, railway locked site. And the one bridge in or out of Eastleigh Works has a weight limit. And so when you try to get things like a boiler out, which the bridge itself has quite tight turns, it becomes a really big nightmare of how are you going to get it out? Is the weight loading for the bridge going to be okay? And so there were a whole host of different aspects of this project that we hadn't really faced in the engineering department before, which really made the project quite interesting. And then because we were in Eastleigh Works, the Watercress Line has a wonderful relationship with Arlington Works, who were really supportive in helping us to achieve a lot of the milestones we were seeing. When the wheels returned back to Eastleigh Works, they used their 2 overhead cranes to help us to re-wheel the frames. And that was kind of my first really big involvement in the engineering side of the project. So getting involved in writing lift plans, making sure it was all safe. And for me, the only goal was to make sure all the volunteers came back with all their fingers attached, because when you're dropping the frames down onto these wheels, they're holding the axle boxes in place so that they don't move. And so it's a very, very slow controlled lift over the top of everybody. And so quite scary with kind of your first engineering project, as it was mine, but it went really successful. And then we had the return of the bogies, which was a really interesting aspect of the project. And that one was really difficult because the 2 overhead cranes where we were situated in Eastleigh Works were decommissioned. So we had to transport Canadian Pacific from one building to another, which meant going out into the yard and coming back into another building. One of the difficulties is that there's always an assumption, we were rebuilding Canadian Pacific. In the building, it had been built in 1941. There's an assumption that not much has changed from a track perspective. It should all be perfectly fine, it's the same gauge, it's all going to go swimmingly well. What we hadn't factored in is that merchant navies in particular are quite a cumbersome locomotive. And when you don't have bogies attached to it, the cab swings quite violently as you move it. So when you turn a corner, it swings the locomotive left or right. And basically it was extremely unstable, which made moving it very difficult. And one of the curves we had to get out of was tighter than any of us had realised, including Arlington Works at this point. And so in the end, we had to put water containers filled on the back of the cab to cause the cab to come down, to really apply that weight so we could move it into the other building to then fit the bogies, which was fine. Once we'd fitted them, it moved much more easily. But that was a triumph in itself to get to the point where we had this rolling chassis. The reality is, from an engineering perspective for Canadian Pacific, it's had a lot of work done, a lot of things that we weren't aware of that were wrong with it. In 2002, Canadian Pacific was on a mainline tour. It stopped at Paddock Wood, and while it was there, it blew a boiler tube. And what we found out is that it was then restricted to heritage railways. It came to the Watercress line, but we didn't realise the extent of damage that that boiler tube had caused to the locomotive itself. So until the boiler was removed, we were unaware that the ash pan had become welded to the frame extension on Canadian Pacific. Where they'd dropped the fire so quickly, that had caused quite a lot of damage in that area. In actual fact, it had warped the entire frame extension. So we had to cut out sections of the frame extension, get new plate made, and rivet and weld new plate into place. So a whole host of work that wasn't factored in because we weren't aware of the damage that had been caused. And then we have the boiler. It's amazing that Canadian Pacific has an original 1941 boiler. It's not its original boiler, but it is an original 1941 boiler, which is a feat in itself to still have something of that age. Unfortunately, when it got non-destructive testing, it came back with only a few areas of kind of degradation. And so we thought it was going to be a simple job. We probably should have known it wasn't. It's a merchant navy. They're never simple if you ever talk to anybody working on them. And unfortunately, as the boiler shop team worked through the boiler itself, they found that it had severe wasting, pitting, several cracked stays, and we also had severe cracks through the inner firebox. We obviously had the four corners, which are where most deterioration on a boiler happens, where the water pools because it can't come out of the boiler sufficiently. So we knew those four corners were bad, but to hear that an entire inner firebox was basically shot and we couldn't use it was a huge blow to the project and to the team as a whole. We spent a lot of time researching what we could do. There was only one place in the country that could press the steel large enough for a merchant navy in a firebox. Canadian Pacific is the first merchant navy to have a full brand new inner firebox. So as an engineering project, that's quite an achievement to build something that no one else has done before and to really take that project on. But it came with a £120,000 price increase in its restoration. So you're facing a huge cost, more hours of work, and the daunting task of replacing 2,200 boiler stays, which no one wants to do. It's not the task anybody wants to take on. So it really did have quite a blow. But in that, we managed to find a positive out of it. So we started working with the British Institute of Non-Destructive Testing to look at how NDT, in its shortened form, would actually need to change to help us in further locomotive restorations. That technology had moved on, but we were still using quite outdated methods to NDT steam locomotive boilers and heritage boilers in general. And so we've been working with them since to improve those methods and to get techniques that could in itself mean that we don't have to remove boiler cladding to be able to inspect the boiler. So you could do pre-inspections really in depth, knowing what the boiler is looking like without dismantling the locomotive, which is a real game changer from an engineering perspective, to have a fully cost project prior to actually taking it apart. So while there were negatives and real kind of downsides that we were finding with Canadian Pacific, we were able to turn them into quite good positives that not only had an impact on the project, but have an impact on the heritage railway industry as a whole. So it was really nice to be able to provide those benefits. Canadian Pacific's really interesting as a merchant navy. We know that there are a number of the class that were built. There are 11 still in preservation. We have Ellerman lines sat in the triangle here in Great Hall. So we do have a lot that survive. But the wonderful thing about Canadian Pacific is she is the oldest and fastest surviving merchant navy. And that is really something that I think is key. This is the oldest that's around anymore. She is the fastest left in preservation. Obviously, Royal Mail beat her. Royal Mail ran 105.88 miles per hour. Canadian Pacific reached only 105 miles per hour. We just ignore that one. So we have these really wonderful aspects that Canadian Pacific represents. Alongside that, Canadian Pacific as a locomotive had a lot of changes throughout its time. It was the only one of the Merchant Navy that was fitted with a mechanical stoker. And this trial was to see if they could increase the distribution of coal into the firebox. Merchant navies are quite coal hungry. Takes a lot to make them work, can be quite arduous for the firemen. Firing these locomotives, particularly on long journeys. And so this mechanical stoker was fitted to trial whether this could replace the firemen on board merchant navies, make them much more efficient. It was a completely failed experiment. The mechanical stokers are used quite a lot in Canada, where they have regularised coal sizes. We don't have that in the UK, so it kept getting stuck. The coal would get stuck in the mechanical stoker, it would break down, and the locomotive would be stranded on the network. Alongside this, it actually increased the consumption of coal because it kept getting stuck. Occasionally, it would feed too much coal into the firebox, and so the consumption of coal on the Merchant Navy itself increased overall. So really inefficient system. Great premise, not great when you take into account how we work here in the UK. So we saw that. Also, Canadian Pacific was sent to the rugby trials in the 50s. And what's really interesting about this is part of that trial was to work out what the capacity output of a Merchant Navy boiler was. No one had been able to kind of determine what that was. So during these trials, they had one fireman on board the footplate shoveling coal. And with that fireman, they couldn't reach the capacity output of the boiler, so they stuck a second fireman. Working in unison, they were shoveling coal into the firebox. And even with two, you cannot shovel coal fast enough for a Merchant Navy boiler to reach its capacity output. So basically, as it stands at the moment, we don't know the limit of a Merchant Navy firebox or a boiler. It is in itself limitless, because we haven't ever managed to get enough coal into the locomotive to reach its limit. There are some hypotheses as to whether, if we actually managed to shovel coal sufficiently enough into that, whether it would actually ever beat Mallard's record, because it has such a powerful boiler. Canadian Pacific, as all of the merchant navies, have these novel features. Change of and valve gear, you've got an all steel welded inner firebox. Obviously there are issues with the design. The streamlined cladding, along with various other aspects, meant that originally in their design they would set themselves on fire. So Canadian Pacific actually set itself on fire once. P&O set itself and a station it was sat at on fire. And so what we would see is that oil would drip out. Sparks were created when the wheels would spin because of a lack of traction, too much power through, and they would spin on the track. And then this would go up in flames. So not a great design overall. At the same time, you have this wonderful boiler. When they got rebuilt in the 50s, they were a much better locomotive to work with. Still temperamental, as with every locomotive. They all have their own personality traits. But it saw kind of the change in a much more efficient design after that change in the 50s to the locomotive. I am really looking forward to seeing Canadian Pacific run again. I spent 4.5 years on the project, and I obviously left before it was finished. We've had COVID since then. It has been a project that I have still followed, and I have still answered many questions from the team at the Watercress Line about what things have been done, where things were kept. Still kept in touch with the wonderful volunteer team who just spent so much time and effort on the locomotive, so much passion. It's sad that unfortunately we've lost a few of the team during this time. For me, we talk about the locomotive as a testament to women, But it's also a testament to all of that passion of the volunteer team. And to see that locomotive, for me, will be a time to remember the volunteers who we've lost during that time, a time to really celebrate the team at the Watercress Line, all of the countless hours, the engineering milestones and absolute nightmares that they've overcome to get to a point where we have Canadian Pacific running. It is going to be a really wonderful thing to see.